help you understand the basics of metabolism. Metabolism really talks about what happens after you absorb your nutrients. So in the last chapter, we had learned about the basics of digestion and how we break things down into the smallest building blocks. In this chapter, we're going to see what happens after we absorb them. Where do the carbohydrates go in our body, and what does our body do with it? Where do the amino acids and the fatty acids go? ChooseMyPlate.gov is a good place to start. We see how food scientists think we should design our meals and our plates. They say at any given portion, half of your plate or half of the portion you're consuming should be fruits and veggies. We've really lowered the amount of carbohydrates that we recommend. And so now, say only a quarter or so of your calories should come from grains, hopefully whole grains where you're getting a mix of proteins and fibers in with the carbs. Smaller proteins over time, food scientists have said if you consume dairy, the amount of protein on your plate can really be reduced. Dairy, surprisingly, is really a carb. There's more calories from carbohydrates in low-fat dairy, anyway, than there is from proteins or fats. And so there has been a trend over recent years. More food scientists are recommending whole-fat dairy, and that as a part of an otherwise low-saturated fat diet, maybe that's the healthy way to go. Okay, so what do we find within all of this stuff? We find chemicals used by the body to produce energy. So remember, there are calories. 4 calories per gram in our carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram in our proteins, and then 9 calories per gram in our fats. So the classes of macromolecules, like we discussed in our last chapter: carbs, proteins, fats. Water, vitamins, minerals, these are micronutrients. We certainly need them, but they're much smaller, and we need them in much smaller amounts. I guess water is sort of its own thing. Obviously, we need a lot of water. A couple of other vocabulary terms here on this slide. Essential nutrients must be ingested, right? We have to get them from our diet. We cannot make them. Certain amino acids can be made or converted one amino acid into another. So if we're eating a limited diet, our liver can convert some nutrients into other nutrients. But anything that's called essential means that we have to consume it. We can't make it. And so there are certain fatty acids and certain amino acids. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. When we talk about the amount of energy in food, we're really talking about kilocalories. Although oftentimes we just say calories. It's actually a capital C. A capital C is a nutritional calorie that is actually 1,000 calories when we talk about it in the traditional physics sense. A kilocalorie is the amount of energy that it takes to raise 1 liter of water by 1 degree centigrade. So in 4 grams of carbohydrates, there's 4,000 calories, or 4 kilocalories. So if we burned that little sugar cube in such a way that we could somehow transfer all of the chemical energy from the sugar cube into a beaker of water containing 1 liter of water, we would raise that by 1 degree centigrade, a small amount of energy. Talking more specifically about carbohydrates, remember that carbs are long chains of these simple sugars called monosaccharides. That word means one sweetener, really. A saccharide is a sweet thing. And we mean it to mean, by monosaccharide, we mean glucose, fructose, or galactose. These are really the simplest building blocks. If we hook these together through dehydration synthesis, or we consume that coupling in our diet, we're talking about table sugar, sucrose, or maltose, which is a special super sweet sugar we put in our chocolate shakes to make them malts, or we put it into beer to make it not quite so bitter. Maltose is a disaccharide. And then lactose, of course, milk sugar. Some of us don't have enzymes for lactose, and we are lactose intolerant. And so in order to handle that milk sugar, we have to take a little Lactaid when we drink our milk or eat ice cream. Polysaccharides are, of course, meaning many, many of these smaller sugars, and they're very complex, huge starches, glycogen, muscle starch, and liver starch that helps us regulate our blood sugar. Oh, the laundry's done. And cellulose. This is a fiber, one of many forms of undigestible carbohydrates. So we don't get any calories when we eat fiber, but that's not to say it's not healthy. It is healthy. A high fiber diet is very healthy, making bowel movements more comfortable, feeding the microbiome, detoxifying the gut, and lowering cholesterol. These are just a few of the benefits of a high fiber diet, not to mention a couple of big research, big articles that came out in the last year or two that have shown that a high fiber diet is decreasing one's risk of colorectal cancers, and that a high meat diet increases the risk of colorectal cancers. So I guess that means we have to eat less meat, but higher quality meat, and then lots of fiber in the diet for a healthy gut. Okay, talking about metabolism, specifically when it comes to carbohydrates. When we eat carbs, whether it's rice or grain or a refined carbohydrate, or my favorite, the chocolate croissant, we are ultimately going to break those carbs down into glucose. So dietary carbs increase my blood sugar. Okay, I've known that for a while. If I have a cookie, my blood sugar goes up a little bit. But if I have 3 or 4 cookies, my blood sugar goes way up. And then that's glucose in the bloodstream. The metabolism of glucose is that we're either going to use it for energy or we're going to store it as glycogen, liver and muscle starch. So this is really the only starch in the human body, and it's also the largest bank of carbohydrates in the body. Pound for pound, you have more glycogen than any other carbohydrate. Blood glucose, of course, is highly variable depending on how much you've eaten and when you've eaten. And then here's the deal. If I continue to eat carbohydrates, so maybe I have a 5th or a 6th cookie, look what happens. I'm not using it for energy because I have all the energy I need from my blood sugar, and I'm no longer going to store it as glycogen because the glycogen shelves are full. So then what? I turn sugar into fat. And this is the downfall of so many good Americans. We have such sweet tooths. Is that a thing? We have a sweet tooth. Collectively, we eat too many carbohydrates, and we're not moving around enough. And so my body says, hey, I'm not just going to pee out that glucose. I got to store that for later. Winter is coming. And so I start to get chubby. Let's see, where does all of that magic happen? Well, the liver converts the simple sugars into glucose, which are then used as an energy source. So if I have a couple cookies and I go for a nice long brisk walk, that's great. I'm just going to put that energy to immediate use. And it's a very healthy way of dealing with carbs in the diet, is to make sure that we exercise after a meal. A good brisk walk will use that energy right away, and we won't have such a spike in our blood sugar, and it won't be converted into fat. However, if we're not moving around and we have too much blood sugar, then we're going to store it as glycogen. Now, this is not a bad thing. We need glycogen in the liver to help us to regulate our blood sugar in between meals, and we need glycogen in our muscle so that we have an immediate source for energy if we go for a really fast walk or a sprint, or if we have to run for our lives or run for our dinner in a natural environment. Remember, glycogen is muscle and liver starch. However, as I mentioned in the previous slide, if we fill up both our blood sugar, our cell sugar, and our glycogen starch, then the body's going to start to convert that to fat. course, sugars also play a structural role in the DNA, RNA, ATP, glycoproteins, and glycolipids. Next, let's talk about fats. Although we have many different types of fats in the body, including phospholipids, remember the phospholipid bilayer, and vesicles, and the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum, so many of our organelles, we need fats in the form of phospholipids to give our cells and the organelles structure. Cholesterol. We're going to talk a lot about cholesterol later, but the first thing you need to know is that cholesterol is not bad. We hear so much about so-called LDL, or bad cholesterol, and its correlation to cardiovascular disease. And certainly that is bad, but not all cholesterol is LDL. Not all cholesterol is bad. And even when it comes to LDL, it's just too much of a good thing. So we need to start to rewire our brains and how we understand cholesterol. Cholesterol is important. Excuse me. We need it in the liver. We need it in the gonads. We need it in the egg. Ladies, when you ovulate, you have to have some cholesterol there. And certainly in the event that the egg is fertilized, the developing embryo uses a structure called the yolk sac to be nourished, and that has tons of cholesterol in it. So we'll talk more about why cholesterol gets a bad rap and the difference between good and bad cholesterols. Working our way from the bottom up here, saturated and unsaturated fats. These are dietary fats, and it really depends on what you eat and how that animal, if it is animal, has been raised. That can really change the fat profile. Excuse me. Looking at other sources of saturated fat in the diet. Meat fats, so marbling in your steak, and the fats in the sausage or processed meats that you might eat. Whole milk contains some saturated fat, and then depending on which type of milk you choose, there would be less saturated fat. So 2% has, less than 50% of what we would find in whole milk, and then 1%, and then skim has no saturated fat in it whatsoever. Cheese and eggs also contain saturated fats. A good rule of thumb is that saturated fats are solid at room temperature. So if you left these things out and separated out the fat, you would see it would be a solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature, so examples include olive oil, peanut oil, canola oil, and the corn and vegetable oils. The take-home message here is that animal-based saturated fats seem to be correlated or to have a higher correlation with disease. And the plant-based saturated fats are probably pretty healthy. Avocado and coconut oil come to mind. So the research suggests that we might think about decreasing the amount of saturated fats from animal and increasing the amount of saturated fats from vegetable, in addition to our unsaturated fats. And we'll talk about omega-3 fatty acids in just a little bit. Okay, the most important and most abundant of all of the fats in your body are triglycerides. This is used for energy. It's stored in our adipose tissue, whether it's in subcutaneous fat or visceral fat. And we'll talk about that a little later. I'm going to show you a really cool image of a side-by-side of different types of fat in the body. Here's the way I remember it. Triglycerides are long-term energy storage. Long-term energy storage. So it's not like glucose, which is used immediately for energy. It's not like glycogen, which can last for a day or two. Triglycerides are good for weeks or months, and this is a way that my body can take excess calories and save them up for a rainy day.